People
Right.
in the chat want him to do second thought.
This guy is like, he's just not, there's no part of him that's, able to do masculine thinking. And what I mean by that, he's very effeminate, he's very dependent, he's
Mm-hmm.
very youthful, he's very subjective, he's very irrational. Things are mostly
You
done. He's not
sexist.
the
Oh my God. Some of
Sure.
the people in our chat are skeptical of a lot of body language stuff, and they're calling this astrology for men. Do you have a
Ooh,
reply to that?
okay, I have a reply to that.
Yeah.
So there is someone you guys are just begging me to type.
I'm going to be
Second
second, gang.
Second thought, who is this guy?
He's a very weird socialist tanky who was recently on a podcast where him and his co-host called what Hamas did on October 7th based.
Here's the thing. I know exactly what he is within a few seconds.
He's like a smug a-hole. That's what I'm guessing.
Well, here's the thing. There's types of people who often have certain points of view, and you see it time and time again.
Right.
So here's the first impression of him. He's very feminine.
Oh, yeah. I noticed that too.
I agree.
Like, I'm just saying, you see it immediately. I'm just saying,
Mhm.
like, this is a pure soy boy. Like, not 20% soy boy, 100% soy boy.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
like, this guy is like, he's just not, there's no part of him that's, able to do masculine thinking. Like, the reality is that, like, he's more feminine than even the majority of women.
This is amazing.
What does
This
that
is
mean
amazing.
exactly? What does that mean exactly?
Did I miss
He's
something
more
funny?
feminine than look. He's more feminine than the majority of
More
women.
than the majority of women. What I mean by that, he's very effeminate. He's very dependent. He's
Mhm.
very youthful. He's very subjective. He's very irrational. Things are mostly
You
done.
sexist. Oh my God.
Like, he has no concept of rationality or objectivity or logical thought processes. He's not very good with facts. Like, I'm just saying, if you want to read,
He's nailing it, Sitch. He's nailing it.
You've nailed it. I don't disagree.
About how women think, and that's exactly how he thinks. Like, what you're
Wow, I'm impressed.
Logically, as someone who's like, all the stereotypes of a woman, that's him.
This is amazing.
So he's an artiste, auxiliary lover. His challenger / demon archetype is the judge, and his shadow is the king archetype.
Those are some feminine archetypes. Damn.
Yeah. So
Dan and I have been friends for like a year, so I've memorized almost all of the archetypes in his book by this point.
So
wait, Adam, I sent you a picture of second thought. You can bring him up just so the audience.
Oh, that's a
has
great
visual
idea.
representation. So.
That's a great idea.
Imagine, second thought with a bright hat. Like, just imagine him just like with a little kind of like pokey little brush to like paint something. Like, he's someone who he doesn't have his only real skills are to gossip, to shame, to rally, and to
oh my God.
Make some
this is incredible.
And every now and then he could just like draw something or do something that's a little bit artsy.
Okay.
So then his auxiliary archetype is the lover, which the lover archetype is much more focused on. They can be it's hit or miss. Some lovers are extremely intellectual, some of them aren't as much. But the lover archetype is much more experiencing life in a way of a flow. It's supposed to experience things to their most deepest emotional impact. And the lover archetype is known for its imagination, its creativity, and its ability to be very high in openness to experience and doing things that are much more different. However, I actually don't think he's very connected to his lover archetype, or else he would actually be more legitimately creative. He would probably be a musician instead of like some kind of commentator. He's very connected to his demon, which he overestimates his ability in this archetype. That's a judge. The judge is very strict. Imagine like Frollo in, Hunchback of Notre Dame. Like, imagine someone who is more of a magistrate. Imagine someone who is much more like a bureaucrat. Imagine someone who is very strict and very legalistic. Someone who just cares about processes and being like, oh, well, you did this wrong, therefore you're bad. but like he doesn't do it in the right way because the normal judge is very, if someone has as their dominant function, they're going to be very objective. They're very going to be high levels of exactitude and strong explanations for him for things. But for him, everything is very hit or miss. Like it's very all over the place. This is someone who
that
can't
demonstrates
logically.
that demonstrates psychological unhealthiness, because if you're healthy, if you're immature, it means your top archetypes are activated, but you don't have strong control over the bottom ones. If you're mature, you've been able to activate all of your archetypes in straight order because
Yes.
you've been able to realize your inner self.
This
If you're
guy
in a
is
really bad place, you have a little bit of the top and a little bit of the bottom.
Correct.
Because if you're in a psychological bad place, you maintain your first archetype because you haven't developed the ones further out. But then on top of that, you are constantly in your shadow because you're stressed.
That's exactly right. So his shadow, though, is the king, which is much more like, or sometimes they call it the Hierophant archetype. That's like the CEO archetype, or someone who's more like in charge of something, or a metaphysical judge of life and earth. A lot of the Greco-Roman gods were this same archetype, and someone who is much more power hungry, someone who's able to be a conqueror, someone who's able to be an incendiary power, or also a patriarch, someone who's able to be a radical individualist. But one of the things I could tell about this guy is that his mindset, the way that he thinks, is much more collectivistic. He's someone who is a longhouse boy, if you know what the longhouse means.
I mean, that's cultural femininity as well. There are no individualistic feminine societies.
Correct.
You have, I mean, as per Kurt Doolittle's Axis, and Adam actually asked me to explain this on the next podcast, the three political axes are individualism, femininity, and authority. And so that's why the vast majority of societies in history are collectivist, because you have the collectivist masculine and the collectivist feminine, and only a handful of more masculine societies become individualistic.
And all else equal, this is actually one of my newest discoveries, is that people have some kind of, I don't know if it's just their face or their energy or something, but you could analyze where people fit in that triangle by like their style.
I'm curious, Dan, where do I fit? Dan and I are good friends and we talk multiple times a week. But where do I fit in that axis?
So believe it or not, you're actually really, this is a small like layering, if not maybe like 2% or something that makes you, but this is something that's very presentational. And this is actually something that's good for you. Does that make sense? Use the term presentational, meaning that it's not something that is like deep. It's something that like people just will think about you on the very surface level.
Yes.
And on that level, you're actually really far removed from individualism.
Okay, so I'm like Tsarism, where presentational.
You are authoritarian, but also leaning feminine. Authoritarian, leaning feminine.
So like the Kaiser's Germany. But what about my actual personality?
Your actual personality is much more individualistic. It's much more like you're able to be your own kind of person. Like you're someone who is much more, your own personality is much more monastic.
Yeah.
Like you actually belong in like the early Middle Ages.
Yeah, no, that's my favorite era of history. I don't see myself as a monk though, because I don't want to be like untrammeled like that. I kind of want to just like my fantasy would be to be a wandering wizard and just wander around the world.
Well, so another thing though is
let me interrupt you for 1 second. Do you have a trouble when you're doing this? Because like with Rudyard, you said he presents differently than he actually is.
I did for many years, and essentially what I've done is I've layered different traits and different systems. I've realized like what exactly am I looking at? You know, it took many, many years to like kind of come up with this. For example, I might be like, oh yeah, Rudyard looks kind of, maybe a girl might say like, oh yeah, Rudyard looks cute or something. And I have to be able to see like, okay, what does that actually mean? On what level of someone's consciousness or psychology does that manifest or does that place? So essentially I'm looking at the presentational layer, I'm looking at the programming layer that includes like people's culture. That's essentially the
Yeah.
software of the mind. I'm looking much more on the heart, on the operating system, which deals with people's strengths, their abilities, what they could actually do. And I'm also going straight to the core, which is their operating system. They're below that, their hardware. So, so one of the things that's good about that, Rudyard, is it's easier for you to blend in among woke people or also like blue haired or pink like haired people, because you don't automatically look like you are someone who is let's say
Nazi.
I went to a very progressive high school and college, so that was a lesson that I just learned to get through life. And also my sister is very far left, and my mom used to be. Then she jumped over to being far right. But so yeah, it's a lesson I've learned. And also, like, realistically, you don't want to dress like an individualist because they tend to dress poorly. Like, no offense to the libertarians in my audience, and I'm the closest thing I am to anything is a libertarian. But if I hear dress like a libertarian convention, that is a red flag.
yeah, but that's a very good point. But however, one of the things I've noticed is people who give those vibes, there's something that's very distinguished about them. There's something that where they're comfortable in their own skin. There's something where they have this certain power, conviction, or knowledge.
I think it's like it's a bell curve where some people who are high individualists have fully realized themselves, and other people are just like nerds. And there's like a great divide between them.
Yeah. Yeah, but on some level, like there's those people who are supremely confident in how they dress and how they act and how they operate. And it's just something that's very unique and it's very powerful.
You actually have to be good at being dressed for that to work off. Like,
yeah, that's a good point. And one thing me and Ryder talked about, we actually live in the worst dressed time in history.
The worst dressed era for upper and middle class people in all of human history, I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's easily the case. Like I can't really compare it to like any other time or era.
Yeah, because we've completely removed class divisions for dress, and we've also removed a concept of beauty. And what that adds up to, like what I say with modern society is that we hate anything that's good. Like if you say you support anything besides a handful of political narratives, like if you if you write poetry and post that online, if you say you like Alexander the Great, if you say that like that you're really into I don't know, like going like our culture despises sincerity, and it despises just like we don't glorify any type of happiness. Like nowhere in our society do we show cultural images of people being happy. And because of that, there's like nothing to aim for. And so everything becomes a negation. And so if you look at our culture, it's all about trying to avoid the negative with nothing positive to aspire to. And so what you've seen is a declassification of dress where everyone is trying to dress as low class as possible, which is why you have a society where people are dressing like literal criminals, which is what streetwear is. But at the same time, they try to wear as expensive criminal clothing as possible to demonstrate that they are still high status. And so it's this weird combination of a culture that tries to push for as little class as possible while still trying to show that what they're doing is expensive.
Hey, can we ask you some questions about how you develop these models? I think people are interested in that.
So really, I worked for another company for a little bit, and they were a platform for life coaches. And what happened was I had a task of analyzing and comparing all the different personality models in the world. And so I essentially looked at 400 different personality theories, models, systems, frameworks. And that, I decided to learn like, where did these come from? I essentially source like the origin of all of them and try to get back to the source and figure out like, okay, what's the genius behind all this? And, I ended up reading a lot of books by Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, like I have some background in neuroscience. I was trying to tie it back to neuroscientific realities, behavioral decision-making, and also anthropological cultures. And, after many, many years of research, I essentially came to the conclusions I have now. So I've dabbled in many, many different fields when it comes to trying to read people. And I have different, opinions about all sorts of stuff, whether it be micro expressions or physiognomy or eye tracking or body language analysis or a number of other topics.
So how did you combine all of those different fields into this one archetype matrix?
It took a lot of time. Really what it was is like, how do you build, a cathedral out of a number of different stones? Or how do you,
Right.
a song, how do you create something like Bohemian Rhapsody? You have to use like a lot of different notes to put it together.
Cool. Sitch, do you have any questions?
Some of the people in our chat are skeptical of a lot of body language stuff, and they're calling this astrology for men. Do you have a reply to that?
Okay, I have a reply to that.
Yeah.
So, astrology is something that's really apt because the reality is that astrology was something that most of the most intelligent, most famous men, most preeminent men of most ages were obsessed with. Now, the problem with astrology is that it's dealing with correlations that might not have any causal value, or at least scientifically we can't prove any causal value. But what this is, though, is you can tie your psychology back to real causal things. If people who think that this is pseudoscience, there's actual hormonal things that are going on that are associated with certain behaviors.
And we've proven this as well. Where, for example, if you have a certain facial shape, you're statistically more correlated to have higher testosterone, which is also correlated with another thing.
That's true.
So we've proven in a bunch of ways that you can look at someone's body and read that it's driven by a certain hormonal or personality disposition.
So when it comes to basic hormones like dopamine, serotonin, testosterone, estrogen, or even DMT, you can tell, like by looking at someone's eyes, I can tell like how much DMT someone is producing. Like I don't really want to go into a super.
This was actually something I did for years before I met Dan, where ever since high school, I would look into people's eyes to figure out how they thought. And that sounds weird, but the reason I say that is that your eyes pick up what information someone's scanning for. And so I kind of use it as a proxy for intelligence in high school, because by looking at someone's eyes, you could see how fast they were processing information and also where in the room they were going. And so for like really stupid people, I find they just stare ahead, and they're just not processing.
Sitch does that all the time.
Well, you could also look and tell like where someone's eyes are moving also indicates what part of cortex is most activated.
Well, look, I completely buy into this. Obviously, you can tell from facial features, testosterone, all kinds of things, testosterone levels, and you're also figuring into body language. So it does seem like there is some correlation between body language and personality.
Stacking correlations on top of each other. So how I view like physiognomy is physiognomy might have, let's say, there might be an 80% correlation with physiognomy, your facial features, and how someone acts or thinks or behaves. And you know what, like that's not very good because 80% is pretty low, because that means 1 out of 5 times you're going to be wrong. And sometimes you're going to be dead wrong. And that's why it's important to look at, okay, what's happening with their eyes? What's happening with their body language? Are there any other keys or figures, things I could look at? And essentially what I've done is I'm looking at enough information to figure out like, okay, well, this is showing this, this is showing this, this is showing this. And I'm assigning different metrics to different levels of consciousness or different areas. So essentially what I have is I have a personality model that has 31,536,000 different personality types. And I'm not quite sure which one. I don't even know which one Rudyard is, but I have a theoretical framework of like, each person on Earth is one of those. And fundamentally, every person, or almost everyone, like you're never going to meet someone who's just like you in your life.
Is there really that many personality types though? I feel like I would max out at like 10 maybe. Like it'd be difficult maybe for me to even get to 10.
Well, here's the thing. You could have numerous different ways of how your neurology works. There's different ways of how you process information. There's different ways of how you digest things. There's different stimulants that you experience. There's different values that you have. There's different ways that you experience reality.
Right.
So it's not just something like, this is a great example. Is like if you were to experience the consciousness of someone else for a brief moment of time, like half an hour, it would feel like a serious trip.
Yeah,
Like,
I
would
I
have a
agree
hard
with
time
that.
understanding, like being like, this is what someone else experiences. It would be completely alien. It'd be completely bizarre. And that's something that is incredibly amazing about the human condition is there's an insane amount of psychological variety. However,
Yeah.
one thing that I'm worried about though is that diversity and that variety is collapsing in real time. People are turning into NPCs.
Right.
What you mean? People are adapting the same personality? What do you mean?
What I mean by that is imagine if a space or a field of different so I have my system is like a circle. There's like 360 degrees. I'm seeing that certain personalities are coming together and they're clustering. So, and this is the same thing that happens in primitive culture. So, for example, imagine a remote tribe in the Amazon. A lot of people are going to be exactly the same. Like what I mean by is literally a lot of people are going to be exactly the same personality. As in, even if there are 31 million different personality types, they're going to be the same. And they're essentially going to be like carbon copies of each other. And it's almost as if they're biological programs. However, when society develops, then you start to have specialization. That's why we had specialization in agriculture and kingdoms and empires, because people were able to do different things. And people can only do different things if there's different psychological diversity.
We found with social science.
So one thing I was going to say, though, is gradually over thousands of years, I think we hit peak psychological diversity about 100 to 150 years ago. And then what happened was, in the last 50 years, we've just gone off, we've gone off like a cliff where it's contracting again. And it's a very scary thing. And, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen long term unless, we might have to rectify this somehow.
Dan and I invented, so I have a theory that I invented that emotions drive civilizations. So like Asian societies tend to be shame driven, Christian ones tend to be guilt driven, like a barbarian warrior ones tend to be pride driven. We're as a rule an anxiety driven society. And Dan and I independently invented basically the exact same 7 metrics for emotions. And then we came together and realized, wait, we have the exact same models. And what happens is that anxiety-based cultures are when you develop a society that is so advanced that you kind of remove reality. And so the way to get ahead is by appeasing social hierarchies and by pleasing people inside the society. But then that becomes an infinite rabbit hole where, because it's based on pleasing people's emotions, there's no feedback loop to the real world. And that's why you get decadence. And anxiety is the marker of a society in decline. And you saw it in the Romans as they fell apart, the Greeks, the Chinese when they were conquered by the Mongols, France for the revolution. And what normally occurs is that the anxiety and the decadence gets rectified by either a major war or a Caesar rising to power. And the opposite of anxiety is fear, which is what the very most primitive tribal peoples do. And for them, it's basically their motivating force, and this is true for ancient religions, is you give sacrifices to the gods so the gods don't destroy you. And you follow your king so the king doesn't whip you. And so all the motivation is through power and coercion. And so what often happens is that once you hit anxiety, because opposite things are often very similar. Once you hit anxiety,
how is anxiety the opposite of fear? I feel like the opposite of fear would be something like security, which I don't necessarily know.
There's a difference between the lack of something and the presence of something, and it's opposite.
Because anxiety happens when your society is so developed that you've kind of removed external threats. And so
fear happens when your society is not developed.
And fear is what happens when your society is not developed at all. Because if you're running away from a tiger, the emotion you're experiencing is fear. When you're trying to get deadlines for your boss and your kids and all that stuff, that your emotion you feel is anxiety. Anxiety is not as active an emotion as fear. And so they're opposites in that they are the stresses that come from being very developed and being very undeveloped societies.
So the reality that's happening now is I've seen in the last few years evidence that we're starting to develop the same psychology as people who live in much more undeveloped countries. What I mean by undeveloped is like imagine some random part of the Amazon or some part of like, New Guinea or something, or some part of Central Africa, which is very, very strange because one of the theories I have about development is if you have anxiety long enough, it actually will become the opposite thing, which is fear.
That's something Carol Quigley was writing about in the 50s, actually. He said, Carol Quigley, who's one of my favorite history writers, he said that you started seeing traits that you see in very tribal peoples develop among middle-class suburban kids in the 50s. And he thought that was bizarre to see, and it includes lack of interest in time, lack of rational thought, then basically de-emphasizing work ethic. Our society spent thousands of years building up very rigid social norms, and then we've deconstructed them all in the last 60 years. And so what you see when you remove those thousands of years of social norms is a return to what looks like a tribal society that never had those in the first place. I think an easy example is that we're tribalistic, and we've also lost the ability for rational thought. I mean, like everyone's in their own little political tribe. And also we're unable to think through clear causal rationality anymore. We don't really care about that. And the question is this something that happens over 5 or 10 years, or is this a long-term historic shift?
Hi, you just listened to a clip from the Sitch and Adams show. If you like what you heard, you can listen to our live show right here on this channel on Sunday, starting at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And if you want, you can super chat us. We read $20 and up super chats on the show and then do a follow-up stream on the following Tuesday where we read the rest of the unread super chats and interact with fans of the show. Subscribe to this channel right here to listen to the live show or to listen to more of our awesome clips.